So thank you very much, everybody, for coming along today to this EDI Caucus seminar. As you may know, we have a seminar series that runs all the way through the caucus, sharing news from the community, but also sharing our own research projects. And today we're going to be hearing from Workstream 3, which is looking at the organisation of work. But particularly, we're going to be sharing the outcomes of a survey we conducted over the first and second year of the caucus across the UK, looking at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns on EDI across the research innovation ecosystem. So the seminar today is going to be led by James Richards, and he is joined by Siddhartha and Joss, but we have a wider research team involved as well, and our thanks goes out to the entire research team for their contributions to the survey. So next slide, please. So my name is Kate Sang and I'm chairing the seminar today. So I'm going to start off by just going over a little bit about the caucus and then I'll hand over to James and Siddhartha, and then I'll reappear at the end for questions and answers. So please do use, we have a Q&A function and you can use the chat function. I should be keeping an eye on both in terms of questions. But we start off with all of our seminars by just reminding everybody of our code of conduct. And we do that because the online space, as you're probably aware, can be subject to hacking or people turning out that shouldn't be here. So the EDI Caucus is dedicated to providing a harassment-free experience for everyone, regardless of sex, gender identity and expression, age, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, ethnicity, religion, or technology choices. We do not tolerate harassment of any event participants in any form, and sexual language and imagery is not appropriate for any of our online spaces or venues, including talks, workshops, etc. And if anybody violates this, which is very unlikely they will, but if they do, we may be forced to remove you from the meeting. And please note that you can activate the closed captions by clicking on the 3 dots at the bottom of your Zoom screen and selecting closed captions option. I also, on my screen, have a little box that says CC in it, and that's to show captions. So please just, if you've got any issues, you can drop us a message in the chat as well, or contact Fenella, who's there under EDICa admin, or me. Next slide, please. So ideally, if you can use the Q&A function to type a question, but if there's any issues with that, please do use the chat function. In the Q&A function, you'll be able to see all the questions people have asked, and you can upvote the ones that you want answered. So if there's something there you are going to ask, you don't need to ask the same question again. You can just put a tick next to it, and we'll know to prioritise the questions with the most votes for them. And also you can use the chat for community discussion, but please bear in mind that the chat is not accessible for everybody. But as I said, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A function as we go through. Next slide, please.
Right.
So for those of you who aren't familiar with the EDI Caucus, I just wanted to give a brief introduction and then I should be handing over to James. So the EDI Caucus, the Equality, Diversity, Inclusion Caucus, is funded by UKRI with additional support from the British Academy. And the overall aim of the EDI Caucus, EDICa for short, is to accelerate equity across the research and innovation ecosystem by providing evidence bases for initiatives to mitigate and overcome barriers faced by marginalised researchers and innovators and everybody working across the ecosystem. So we've undertaken this by researching an evidence base for inclusive careers across the UK research and innovation ecosystem. So that's not limited to universities, that's looking at research funders, employers of different sizes, learned societies, professional bodies, etc. To identify and remove barriers experienced by marginalised groups, and to support marginalised researchers and innovators to not just access a career in research and innovation, but to thrive in that career. EDICa is interdisciplinary, so we have scholars from across the social sciences, humanities, natural sciences, and physical sciences. And we are, through all of our research projects and our stakeholder engagement groups, creating national and international communities of practice who will be upskilled in terms of delivering evidence-based initiatives to improve equity. And co-design is at the core of everything we do with EDICa. So we work under a motto of nothing about us without us, and we're co-designing with people with lived experience of marginalisation and oppression, as well as wider stakeholders in the research and innovation ecosystem. So again, thank you very much for coming along today, and I am very happy now to hand you over to Professor James Richards, who will talk you through the study.
Thanks, Kate. Sorry, just having a little bit of problems with changing my slides, as you've no doubt spotted already. Yeah, thanks for the intros and welcome everybody. And thanks for setting out the spirit of our events and outputs, Kate. So I'll just quickly take you through how we're going to go through the findings from the report. Obviously, the report has been published for a good few weeks now and is available. I don't know whether that can be put in the chat in the meantime, just in case anybody who's signed up hasn't got a link to that, and save you Googling around for it or trying to find it. This gives you a quick overview of where we're coming from, tell you about what the research is about. We're going to try and narrow down the focus of the presentation because the report, if anybody's even had a quick look at it, is quite hefty. So we're going to try and narrow it down to a slightly more particular focus. The report is always there and stands in itself. If you want to consult that, I'll come back to that at a later point. I'll provide you more details on that in a few moments' time, as is customary in all these kind of presentations. I'll take you through how we went about designing the research, what kind of method, and how we analysed our data. And then we get to the stage where hopefully this is what most people are interested in. We'll take you through the findings. They're divided up into 4 sections, just so we can kind of get through this in hopefully in a way that allows us to give you some idea of the broad findings, but also slightly narrowed down findings as well. I'll present to you findings 1 and 2, and then Siddhartha is also on the line. Probably see his picture now. He'll take you through findings 3 and 4 and go through the conclusions, and I'll step back in again when it comes to the recommendations and next steps, because this is a project that, whilst we've come a long way with it and we made some pretty good and important conclusions and recommendations from it, we are going to do some follow-on research from that. So that's what we're going to take you to at the end of this presentation, and that might be the basis by which that you want to comment or ask any questions. So in terms of the research itself, it was driven and set around one particular research aim and one particular research question. And the aim is to examine and understand the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on EDI in the UK's research ecosystem, and in doing so, make recommendations for change to key stakeholders with vested interest in this critical part of the UK's economy. And a question that goes with it, which is, should be no surprise in one sense, is what has been the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on EDI in the UK's research and innovation ecosystem? So that's the kind of question that we're hoping to address as we go along today, but we're going to tailor it slightly around a couple of groups. So just to say what the focus of the presentation will be, we'll cover a wide range of issues related to EDI, the pandemic and the research innovation ecosystem, provide you with some general findings, which are all there in the report. But what we will be focused on are two particular groups that we've got quite high samples on related to for the groups that we could probably have a lot more to say. And the two groups that the EDI Caucus has focused a lot of its attention on over the last 2 years or so, and will do for the rest of the lifetime of the project, and hopefully its legacy will serve such groups very well. So Siddhartha will be doing part of the presentation. Will be focused on two groups, disabled and neurodivergent groups as well, and then we'll finish off with some general and specific recommendations. So in terms of research design, this has kind of already been mentioned already, or if anybody's familiar with the work of EDICa, will know already that two pillars, if you like, of EDICa is this notion of co-design. The survey that this is ultimately built around was in large part the result of a co-design process. It's probably important to note that in particular we have a section on bullying and sexual harassment, and that was an aspect that literally directly came from the co-design process. Here we broadly go about doing the research and framing everything we do here at EDICa around the social model of disability, and just reflecting the idea of how EDICa is very much about how do we kind of shape and transform the way that work is organised across the research innovation ecosystem, and how we're only really going to resolve issues related to disability if we remove those barriers which are intrinsically linked to the way organisations organise the work and the structures and the processes, etc. So the methodology that we chose was mixed methods, although principally at this stage it involved a quantitative survey. We also approached the design in terms of a convenient sample. It would have been great to have had a representative sample. We did lots of things along the way to try and increase the representativeness of the data that we were gathering, but there's limitations to that, as anybody knows, when it comes to doing this kind of research. So the nature of the survey and the questions were all about asking participants, and all participants needed to have been working in the research innovations ecosystem in the UK from around about March 2020 onwards. It could be the case that people subsequently left, and many people probably did leave research innovation beyond that point, but we didn't include people who have joined since the pandemic and the lockdowns began, which is now scarily, in one sense, 5 years ago now. So most of the questions, in a sense, follow the example here in the context of your work experience as the COVID pandemic began. How would you currently rate, etc., etc., etc. Certainly related to the questions related to the work environment and job satisfaction. And as just to kind of follow on in the 4 key areas that we made the focus of our research was the work environment. I think it was 28 questions we asked around work environment and job satisfaction. We followed a very much a widely used scale of job satisfaction and built around that. That's War et al.'s from 1979's job satisfaction scale. We also looked at EDI at work, ultimately based on what we believe would be good EDI related initiatives. Again, these are all things that will become more apparent if you're not familiar with the report so far. That these things will become self-evident once we get to the findings. We also considered 2 other aspects that relate to EDI in some way, in effect, almost things that form the context of EDI, healthcare, childcare, and caring and services, and whether participants could get access to such services. And we end with bullying and sexual harassment, which are not necessarily EDI per se, but we felt that they were an important component part to trying to grasp and get an idea of, especially in the context of the pandemic, where a lot of people, especially in research and innovation, worked remotely. And since then, it's figured probably more prominently than it did before the pandemic, even though there's been a lot of change and a lot of return to so-called regular ways of working in the last few years. In terms of methods and data analysis, just mentioned already that we used a survey. We ran it through the Survey Lab platform. We recruited over quite a substantial period of time, around about 5 or 6 months. Towards the end of 2023, we got around about 570 or so usable responses, which we felt was very impressive, given that it was quite a meaty survey, so to speak, and anybody online who completed that survey, we thank you for your contribution. But I think one of the things that surprised us in a way is that we got a good number of responses, and very few actually didn't finish the survey, which can often be the case if you have quite a detailed and lengthy survey. In terms of recruitment, EDICa has developed a range of networks since it's began 2.5 years ago, and the use of social media and its newsletters and a range of partners helped us distribute the survey far and wide. We'll give you an idea of the sample in a few moments' time. Most of the questions were run across a 5-point Likert system, with 5 being very satisfied, down to 1. Those numbers will have more resonance in a few moments' time when we get to the actual findings. Most of the data, and the person who's most responsible for that is Siddhartha. So if you've got any questions related to anything to do with the statistical aspect of the research, then we've got Siddhartha on hand. But just to kind of give you a flavour, we use SPSS and some parametric testing, as you can see below, and we also look for statistical significance at the 5% level. And again, that's something we do return to when we get to looking at the research findings, especially related to disability and neurodivergence. So in terms of the first part of the findings, just take you through some of the details of our sample. It is a convenient sample, so we're very much aware that in some senses our survey or sample in terms of participant characteristics, first of all, represents some groups that are overrepresented and some groups that are underrepresented, and some groups that we've managed to get, broadly speaking at the least, good representation based on the broader kind of population. Not least in terms of the 2 groups that we want to spend quite a bit of time of this presentation focused on, that is disabled groups. We managed to get a sample of around about 19.4% when the broader population is at 24%. 19.4% of our participants were neurodivergent, and that's set against an estimated population in the wider population around 15 to 20%. So quite a range of other things that probably may stand out unless you're about the age groups, but clearly we have an over-representation of women in the study, likewise underrepresentation of men, and quite a few other groups that are, but you know, a relatively good sample, and something we want to be upfront and clear about before proceeding to the actual findings themselves. In terms of a range of other characteristics that we gathered data on in order to analyse the data, which, just to be clear, that we've only really begun to analyse the data. There's plenty of other ways in which we feel that this data can be analysed. Any further thoughts and ideas on that are also things that we'll be more than welcome to hear from you as well, in terms of comments and questions. But again, when we think of it in organisational or personal job-related characteristics, some groups again are pretty much well represented in terms of what the population, broad population may be, and likewise some are underrepresented and overrepresented. So for example, full-time employees, STEM employees and unionised employees, often unionised organisations, are overrepresented, but in a similar situation, underrepresented are part-time employees, arts, humanities, health, social sciences employees, and non-unionised people from non-unionised organisations. Okay, so moving now to what is the most important part of the research. This is when we start to get into the actual details of the actual findings, and the first part in the main really is looking at the general impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the research innovation ecosystem. So first of all, a lot of information to present to you, so in order to try and make it a little bit more accessible and easy to read, similar to the report, of course, is that we've listed off here the 28 areas of the work environment and job satisfaction, generally speaking, according to the sample, and how they've been rated. And as you can see, we've colour-coded them just so that you can see what are rated the highest by people who work in the research innovation ecosystem, reflecting on that time of the survey back to the time of the actual lockdowns. And we've also highlighted the areas of the lowest rated, perhaps of most concern, but there's quite a long tail, if you like, in terms of relating to the more lower rated things. So in terms of the things that our participants kind of felt that were more favourable, aggregating figures around about 3.9, 3.92 was access to flexible working, and also jointly second favourite home working conditions, and also job autonomy. If we kind of look at in terms of what was least appreciated, we can see that down at the bottom is promotion opportunities, the way that the organisation is organised, and actual recognition of the work that's done. So in a sense, I think we have to be careful when we look at job satisfaction or the work environment either individually, because ultimately it's often a collection of things that really kind of set the scene of, and I think it's fair to say, before going any further really, that this does represent some really quite mixed results, and it's hard to say whether access to flexible working is a compensation in a way for or lack of promotion opportunities, or a lack of recognition of the work that people do, and especially given that this was, as we all know, a really quite difficult time to be working and to keep concentrating and keep trying to move things along. So moving now to the second part of the survey, and this is where we looked at EDI initiatives, and just to kind of take you through some of the things that appear to be more positively experienced across the research and innovation ecosystem. Support for family emergencies was rated by the looks of it, really quite highly compared to many of the other EDI initiatives, followed by commitment to equality and inclusion, which is quite positive, of course, and EDI policies themselves. But if you kind of look at it from the opposite direction and see where these things are least rated, I think this probably brings out issues that are probably closer to people's probably experiences, let's say, or as is the case with addressing pay gaps. That's something that's figured quite prominently, certainly across the UK's higher education system for a good few years, in terms of a range of disputes been around pay gaps, the use of equality impact assessments, a sense that when change is brought upon people, equality doesn't appear to figure prominently in decisions that are made, or certainly doesn't appear to be addressed in people's own personal lived experience as well. And just to kind of add, a third area that's of concern is the use of external EDI expertise. I kind of sense that, or at least interpretation, that organisations are trying to address EDI issues, but perhaps not having the right level or the right kind of expertise to draw upon in order to make important and fundamental decisions that reflect a good percentage of the working population. So moving now to factors that relate to the external environment of EDI. There are only 5 things that we looked at, but these are kind of 5 big things in one sense. And again, we've generally colour-coded them, perhaps less than we need on this particular slide than the other ones, because we only got 5 to go at. But in terms of the things that are, one key thing that is one that has been relatively favourably experienced, that is access to needed medication. I mean, that in itself has been quite a controversial issue. Certainly, depending on the medication that you're looking to access, that has been an issue that relates to the UK leaving the European Union, for example, a breakdown to a certain extent in supply chains there. But where we're seeing probably more concern really is, and again, this is just because it's the lowest rated one, we've highlighted it, access to support to care for a disabled or an ill adult. But apart from access to needed medication, the rest of the other EDI context are relatively low rated. Access to primary health care, for example, and access to secondary care as well. So I think I now got just 2 more slides to go through before I hand you over to Siddhartha. Make some comments on the part of the survey. We looked at bullying first of all in the next slide, where we looked at sexual harassment. First to acknowledge, and pretty obvious in one sense, if you know your statistics, that this is based on a relatively small sample. You know, we had around about 570 so across the full sample, but in terms of the people who completed the final part of the survey, numbers dropped quite sharply, and we would expect that to happen. We wouldn't expect everybody to have had some personal experience of bullying and harassment, whether it's been experienced directly or witnessed indirectly. Just to kind of put this into some kind of context, I think if you look at the general statistics in terms of the number of people or the percentage of any general workforce that experiences bullying in particular, it's around about 8 or 9%, and we're seeing figures here even early on during lockdowns a little bit higher than that, again based on small samples, something that we're looking to address. I'll come back to that at the end of the presentation, but I think it's important to note that in one sense this is the findings, but you know, when you do presentations like this, you tend to kind of go through things that are not necessarily presented directly in the report. When we co-designed the survey, the people that we spoke to, there was a sense that bullying and sexual harassment had increased during the pandemic, when the figures here quite clearly show, despite them being based on a small sample, have increased fairly and quite highly, really, in a sense. It's quite shocking to think that 24% of people have witnessed bullying in some kind of way since the pandemic, and how bullying and experienced or witnessed during the pandemic was quite high as well. And that's the time when a lot of people kind of assumed that people were being a little bit more kinder to each other, and organizations were being, you know, perhaps not pressing down on the pedal related to performance management as much as they had done until that around about that time. So this is just going to end, and I'm going to hand you over to Siddhartha, who will tell you the story of disabled and neurodivergent employees in the research innovation ecosystem. During the same period, this is 3 tables. First of all, highlighting who our participants attributed sexual harassment, who did they report it to, and what was their sense of satisfaction in terms of a response to the organisation when it's been reported. Although it's important to note that a lot of people, I think it's around about 1/3 or so, didn't report in the first place. So in a sense, you know, sexual harassment from colleagues went up relatively sharply after lockdown. Reporting to line managers went up after lockdown. Maybe that's something to do with accessibility. Perhaps people see more people more in person. But I think that the thing that stands out the most, but cautioning very much so on the size of the sample, the lack of satisfaction with how sexual harassment was dealt with in organisations. I think we had minimal responses who indicated that they were satisfied in some way. And I think during the lockdowns, we didn't find anybody at all who was satisfied with the way that the organisation dealt with the response. So I'm just going to move on to part 3, and I will mute myself, and I'll hand over to Siddhartha, who's going to take you through this part 3 and part 4 of the findings. Siddhartha.
Thank you, James, for laying up the foundation of the analysis and the presentation. So within the, specifically when we talk about the disabled workers and the neurodivergent workers, and within the research and innovation ecosystem, one major change that we are doing also while doing our analysis and also for the presentation is that we are looking at the significance which was happening on each of the factor. So when you are looking at the table, what you will see is that the segment which has been color coded in blue is statistically different in terms of the p-values that are there. So all the parts which are blue in color they were statistically significant and that they were having some amount of impact that was there. And we had multiple factors which are actually playing in when it comes to the job satisfaction in the work environment experiences, specifically at the time of pandemic. What we further did was that whichever were the significant ones, we were also looking at that within the disabled and the non-disabled um, workers, what are the major three trends which are top four rated and which are the three most bottom one that were there. So when we talk about the top four, it was basically the home working condition that was a very important factor that was playing in terms of that it was important to them, be it for disabled or non-disabled. This is where we took up the means. Second was access to flexible working, because there was like hybrid working, remote working, and post lockdown space also there was this particular aspect that people were looking at accessibility in terms of having a more flexible workspace that was there. What were the sick leave aspects that were there? That was another important thing, which was the top aspect that, uh, and this is where the support from the line manager or the organization in terms of the policy played a very important factor. And autonomy to do the job. When you talk about flexibility or hybrid workspace, autonomy is something which is really important in terms of how does it work. So it was a significantly important factor to look at in terms of how people were perceiving it. Which are the factors which were not something which made a very important difference was one was the rate of pay, because that was in factor because people were looking at, I think job survival was a more important point, job security became an important aspect. Other was the way organization is managed in terms of the policies that are there. Um, because they were being flexible in terms of how policies can be changed as per the time or the requirement. So that was something which was not actually playing much important factor when it came through. The other point was promotion opportunities, as there were certain aspects where like people were looking what is our next career stage. That was not something that people were significantly very much considering when we were looking at job satisfaction and work environment, specifically during that particular time. Next slide, please. Then, when we talk about the participants experiencing bullying during and the post-lockdown, one particular trend mostly you will see is that it has increased. Something that was explained, discussed by James earlier as well, is that even in the sample that was which was 104 out of 576 people who responded on this particular part, there was a difference in terms of people who were experiencing it and people who were witnessing it. But the trend increased, except in one or two certain circumstances where people said that during the lockdown it was less. Otherwise, if you look at it, post lockdown, it actually kept increasing. This was also dependent on some of the factors that how the policies were changing or how the organization might be supporting it. So this was something that also made us look at it, that will be part of the further study that we are looking at. Next slide, please. Then it was very important that once we looked at disabled community, then we looked at neurodivergence as an important factor. The reason was that our sample was almost a significant part of the population that we were looking at. So it was like 15 to 20%. That was important for us. Again, the factors changed up, and when you look at the significant factors, these were rate of pay, relationship between management and staff. So basically, a line manager and your relationship, way organization is managed, still remain one of the significant factors. The factor that came different was support to external funding and opportunities to author, because it is research and innovation ecosystem. So there were like concerns about authorship, not just for papers, reports, but the other particular aspects. What remains very significantly important was for somebody from the neurodivergent community, home working conditions, access to flexible working, job autonomy were really important as a factor, which was very different when we compared to neurotypical person who was like, for me, the more important point was flexible working, the sick leave part, and a concept that James has worked on is the livism part, where people still keep on continuing to work even when they've taken up a leave. So that was something that was bit different that turned up. Another part that actually also was, which was on the lower side, was in terms of which was not very important, was support to apply for external funding, promotion opportunities, and the organization is managed was something that people were like not very much concerned about. That okay, it was a factor for their job satisfaction aspect that was there. Next slide, please. When we talk about workplace bullying and harassment, the trend still continues. And what happens is that people who are experienced or witnessed bullying, post-lockdown it increased. It is also a representation that people had concerns about the accountability aspect, also in terms of how the various aspects were handled. Were they satisfied or not with the way certain particular aspects were handled? And also in terms of were there certain issues which got neglected because of the person who was getting involved in? So that's where we see a kind of a change in the trend on this particular aspect, where bullying and harassment increases post-lockdown. Next part, I'll be talking about the conclusions. Next slide, please. So we are dividing the conclusion in two parts. One is some of the general conclusions aspects which are there from the overall report that we are looking at. And we can look at maybe the main three parts that which are the best performing aspects, which are still very good in. So these were in terms of autonomy at work, relationship with colleagues, flexibility in work location hours, openness to flexible work, uh, uh, any kind of a tailored support that people were looking at, accessibility of EDI resources. And there were other areas which are problematic part, which was in terms of access to social support, access to mental health support. There were like workload aspects, job security aspects, which are point of concerns that were there. There was critical gaps in employee experiences, which was in terms of maybe the openness to flexible work, EDI training availability, social service access. These were some of the factors which were there. There are critical structural EDI issues which remain unaddressed, and that's where the aspect that comes of EDI representation and leadership, support after raising concerns. Sometimes even absence of intersectional data or data collection was one of the part that was there, and underrepresenting mechanism was the other part. External resources had a significant impact, and it was in terms of the policies and everything that was coming through, and also in terms of it had a direct impact that how external sources play out. It was issues which are typically beyond that of research and innovation organization system, that you need to have partnership with external supporters to make things work in a particular direction. As I said, trends have in sexual harassment and bullying were continuously changing, and then it was a point of a concern that was there. Next slide, please. When we talk about disability and neurodivergence, there was a clear-cut appreciation of home working important to both disabled and neurodivergent employees. And this was something which actually is part of, we had responses from people where they said that, how it makes a very important impact in terms of how the work can be more flexible, and they're able to contribute more when the flexibility is provided. Job satisfaction, both for neurodivergent employees and for disabled employees, was low in certain key areas, which I did point out. It is also clear that higher level of bullying and general level was observed by disabled and neurodivergent individuals. This was also because the needs were different, and also maybe sometimes because of the policy, certain aspects, it is dependent on the discretion of the line manager, how it is going to be implemented. We also have carried out further studies on that particular part. One point that we have is that right now what we are presenting is basically the statistics and significance part. There are more insights that will come out when we talk about the intersection of disability and neurodivergence as the data analysis part. So that will bring more insights. Now I'll hand it back to James.
Sorry, slight panic there. I was actually addressing one of the questions that had been asked, and then I couldn't find where my mute button was. So just to generally provide some details of our recommendations, if you've seen the report, and as we kind of mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the report was set up to make recommendations to the full range of stakeholders, the research and innovation ecosystem, certainly when it comes to matters related to EDI and they're all listed there in effect, and there are details in the report related to them. What we thought it might be more important to address and to probably bring to people's attention if they're not already aware of it is that we obviously recommended a range of changes to the funders for this project and many other projects across the research and innovation ecosystem in the UK. It comes from government funders led out of organisations such as UKRI. What we felt was important to do was to actually run these by the funders, just to kind of get an idea of their ideas related to what we're thinking of as well, and effectively co-design them. So this is just to kind of give you an idea of what we came to a conclusion over. First of all, just evaluate how demographic questions related to disability and neurodivergence are phrased. So, for example, or really to tackle the issue of low reporting, and one way of address the low reporting of such protected characteristics in the research innovation ecosystem is not necessarily to ask people whether they're disabled or not. Best to ask people whether they relate to effectively the Equality Act 2010 definition of disability, which is either a lifelong condition or a condition that's lasted for 12 months or more, or is cancer or MS, that impact on work and in a significant fashion. And we find that not just even in this context makes an important difference. Other recommendations: further work is required related to intersectionality effects and patterns across disciplines, something that we need to do more number crunching and statistical analysis of the data that we have in other data sets in order to get an understanding of the nuances related to intersecting identities. Regular and consistent surveying of EDI in the research and innovation ecosystem, effectively some kind of monitoring system, long term as well, of course, and in that report, improve the reporting of EDI by research and innovation organisations, because I think there is quite a lot of missing data, and a lot of organisations find it difficult to report on these. Anybody's had to deal with some kind of Athena Swan initiative will probably almost certainly be aware that it's often difficult for organisations to drive this kind of data, and this is the kind of data that needs to really feed back into the funding system. And in terms of the levers that could be pulled related to EDI, there are many, and they should all be pulled in unison, but the funders probably have, in one sense, more sway over what could be done in research and innovation than perhaps all the other stakeholders individually. And prepare for future or significant or dramatic events. Ironically, at the time when we wrote this report, we were thinking potentially of another pandemic, but I think what we're talking about here are major radical political changes at this moment in time, but I won't say any more on that at this moment in time. Just to finish with some next steps, I did hint at earlier that we were planning some further research in this domain. Siddhartha, who's on the call now, has been working on a qualitative version of this report. We did some follow-up focus groups. We've got plenty of qualitative data from the survey itself. Unfortunately, it just didn't fit into the report that we're feeding back to you now, and we're hoping that in the not too distant future we'll be releasing to you a version of the qualitative findings and digging deeper into what the lived experience is in relation to EDI and the research innovation ecosystem in the aftermath and as a consequence of COVID-19 pandemic. We are going to be rerunning the survey again, not just because we got a relatively small sample related to bullying, sexual harassment, but certainly as a response to that, we certainly revealed what we think are some really quite interesting, but also more importantly, quite worrying trends. So we're looking to run that first as a sequence of two surveys, effectively not running the surveys it wasn't run originally. So if you hear about that in the not too distant future, we're hoping to try and disseminate that again sometime in the next 3 or 4 weeks. Please help us support us get that survey out far and wide. And the original survey, we had around about 140 respondents, hoping to get a much higher response, and ultimately we still have a data set to compare what any new data we get on that particular area. And also some of the findings as well, I was going to feed it into a key aspect or key output of EDICa that relates very much to the work stream that this project relates to, and another work stream 1 as well. A virtual reality output as well, what makes for an enabling workplace, and certainly focusing very much on EDI characteristics. So I'll finish there. This is a copy of the report. I know you can't click on that link. I think a link has been put into the chat at some point, and I will stop sharing and I'll hand you back to our chair and PI for the EDI Caucus, Kate Sang, and see if we've got any questions for us at all or comments.
Thanks very much, James and Siddhartha. So we've had some questions starting to come in, which I'll just go through, and there's another open one, but I'll go through the 2 that you've answered already. So we had a question in terms of the timing of the analysis. Is it a comparison between different groups of people surveyed at 2 time points during and after lockdown, or is it a retrospective comparison with the same individuals? So it's a retrospective comparison. The EDI Caucus didn't start until 2023, so it wasn't possible for us to do a kind of contemporary analysis during the caucus. And then the second question is, are we able to explore variation within neurodivergent respondents, for example, identifying any differences between individuals who may have different assessments, for example, ADHD, dyslexia, etc. And James has shown that we didn't ask for that level of detail. I think it's also important to say that our focus is on the working environment rather than the conditions itself. So for us, the diagnosis is almost secondary in terms of what are the effects at work. So very much a focus on how do we change the working environment to suit people. So we've got some questions coming in. Thank you, James. Thank you, Siddhartha, for sharing interesting findings. Because the study explored areas such as work environment, I'm wondering whether we can find some parallels between this research and broader policy efforts to promote fairer and more inclusive workplaces, for example, in Scotland. So I think the questioner there is probably hinting towards the Fair Work framework, potentially. So James, I don't know if you want to take that.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, I think it's probably what we can reveal now, though it's hidden in the detail to say the least, is that folk at the EDI Caucus, because we're based in Scotland, we've also done work related to the Fair Work framework, which is not a massive difference from other frameworks for good work in England, and I think there's also a Fair Work in Wales as well. It has been broadly influenced by that, and it certainly is some scope for us to write up the research in different forms to kind of reflect such initiatives. I mean, in another sense, we're also very much looking to influence other frameworks, ideally regulatory frameworks, not least the bill that's currently going through Parliament in the UK Parliament and the Employment Rights Bill. Hopefully we can have some traction in there as well. So yeah, this is something that we certainly interested in influencing. There was something else I was going to mention then, but it's escaped me.
Well, it may come back to you, so we've got time for it to come back to you. Then the next question, so I'm not reading out people's names just for benefit for the purpose of the recording, but so we've got a question here that's not from Fenella. So as I understand it, bullying and harassment seem to increase post-pandemic. Are there any ideas on why coming back to work, in person or post-pandemic broadly that might have resulted in the increase? And I'm wondering, Siddhartha, if there's anything from the focus groups that might help to answer that question.
So actually, I'll answer from the 2 parts. So within the study, we also looked at open-ended responses on this, that why somebody is reporting it like that. And of course, there were focus groups from where the data comes through. So when people came back post-lockdown, so it was not a uniform policy. So it was dependent from organization to organization where it was in the research and innovation ecosystem where it belonged, and also what kind of flexibility was asked. So like when we looked at the three significant factors, it was on job flexibility, autonomy, and relationship with line manager or the organization. So these are like 2-3 factors that are there. I'm just giving 1 or 2 points on that, where somebody would have faced that if they want maybe 2 days a week, and because of the organization's particular policy, it will say you need to be in the organization for more than 2 days or 3 days. It would have led to certain scenarios, and the implementation part was not something which was very common. Something which comes from both quantitative and the qualitative part, where it says that the EDI implementation and the policies could have from the external aspects, could have played an important role, where people would have felt that there's a discretion that is coming through on implementation of policy. So that is where people felt that it was different. Secondly, long-term health conditions and caring responsibilities became an important factor post-pandemic, and they were very different. They were getting acknowledged in a very different way because of the life situation. And I think that is where social model of disability is very important in terms of an understanding that it's not the medical health, it's basically on your life position. That's very important. That if somebody is having a caring responsibility or child care responsibility, if the policy is not very inclusive, it might lead to a difference in terms of perception of the work or how it gets there. So that's why we are seeing that people reported that post, be it experienced or be it witnessed. So witness part is also where somebody else, my colleague or somebody who I know might have faced bullying or sexual harassment, might be there. So that would have made a difference. So that's the reason that we see this particular trend.
I was going to come back to you, James. So, James, would you like to add to that?
All I was going to add to that is, based on the final slide, is that is very much something that we hope to come back to with a follow-up survey, and to see whether whether that trend has persisted since, because in many ways it could have gone down again, who knows. But if it stayed high or gone higher than that, then we do need to explore that in more depth, and I think that might be one of the ways in which that we elicit comments, is we might want to ask why people, what's changed about the nature of the work or the environment that they feel that has led to the bullying or sexual harassment that they've either experienced or witnessed. Okay.
And James, I see you've added an extra response to the question around policy frameworks. Was there something you wanted to add for the purposes of the recording?
Yeah, it wasn't specific related to policy frameworks, related to the angle that I was taking initially, which was more to do with government regulatory frameworks. I just wanted to say that some research that we did do, that we completed around about a year or so ago, has subsequently gone on to influence quite substantially a matter related to EDI, related to doctoral training grants. So just to kind of say, this is very much part of a range of things. It's probably premature at this stage to kind of be certain about what the impact of this research may be, but based on this research we've done previously in other aspects of EDICa, and what EDICa is all about, it's not just about creating a solid base of evidence. The idea is to push for a real change and impact. That's why we were commissioned, and that's what we were about in terms of a project team and the philosophy that surrounds it, and what we're commissioned to do.
Thank you very much. So just to give people a chance to maybe come in with a final question in the last 5 minutes, I wondered if James and Siddhartha, you might be able to reflect on the fact that we have quite a high reporting rate of disability in university, and did both mention it when you spoke. The data generally from universities and from HESA is usually sort of somewhere in the region of a 5% reporting rate of disability, and we've always known that's an under-reporting rate. So I just wondered if you could reflect a bit more on maybe why is it that this survey had such a high reporting rate, one that's more consistent with what we might expect to see in the general population? For either one of you.
I can start with that, Kate. And I think it's important to state that I don't think there's anything explicit in the data set itself. Siddhartha, please correct me if I'm wrong, or wildly wrong even. But I think there are a number of things that probably led to a good response rate from such groups. And I think one thing that was mentioned in the final slide was how we termed certainly disability, referring in a sense to the definition of disability rather than the term disability itself, although we did actually add a clause at the bottom saying, almost saying like PS or a star, you know, this is the actual legal definition of disability. I think it's fair to say, I think we've come across this in a range of contexts, Kate, that there is a misunderstanding to a certain extent of what disability actually means. And I think when people get an idea and the term is presented to them in a manner that they can relate to, and in a less stigmatizing way, the term disability is stigmatizing in itself. And I think people are just more likely to, you know, identify with that and therefore check that box. I think that's one of the reasons. And I think, you know, conversely, that's perhaps too strong a word. It's one of the failings potentially of people who gather data normally on this. If it's a staff survey or a HESA data, etc., then they use a term that people just are put off by, stigmatized by. And I think the nature of a lot of work across research innovation is just not friendly towards disabled or neurodivergent people. And I think people, as we probably learnt, are put off simply because it's not a helpful thing to identify as. But I would say my other key reason why I think that I think as a project, I think it's been quite a powerful project in the sense that I think it became quickly apparent that who's to say for certain what actually happened, but I like to think it was the nature of the team that we are as EDICa, that we're a trusted research centre. And I think by us sending out surveys and call for participants, that people have trusted us, that we are this is something that we represent, changing and transforming EDI across ultimately a very large sector, of course. So I think a lot of it's to do with who we are as people and in terms of how we set ourselves up and our key philosophies, you know, co-design research and use of the social model and trying to transform workplaces and not trying to change people. Have you got any extra thoughts and ideas, Siddhartha, at all?
So I got like only two. So one thing was that it was a survey that was running for actually a substantial time, which was almost 6 to 7 months. And one very important point, because of the co-design approach, the survey was very inclusive, and the language was something that made the survey not something being targeted, but felt that, okay, this is getting included. Like if you go through the report and if you go through the survey, you will understand that you will look at it that it represents being more inclusive and look at various conditions which may not be there in most of the quantitative surveys when we look at EDI approach or even some of the census data. So I think that worked in our favor where specifically these two particular groups turned out responded in a better manner. So that helped. Like if you look at survey, it actually represents the ethos of EDICa in terms of being more inclusive for everybody and give an opportunity. So that worked in our favor.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So thank you so much, James and Siddhartha, for that presentation. And also thank you to the wider research team for all of their support in getting the report together, collecting the underpinning data, the co-design workshops, disseminating the call for participants, all of that. And thank you everybody for coming along today and for your questions. And Fenella has put into the chat that our next seminar is on the 13th of May. We've got quite a packed agenda for the remainder of the caucus, the last kind of 7 or 8 months of the caucus. Please do share with your networks. Please do get involved. And thank you so much again. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.